Now, this is always an interesting time of the year for me because as we come to December, as we get to explore what is Christmas, what is the meaning of the Christ, we always get into the mystical. And Dr. Holmes tells us that a mystic is not a mysterious person, but a mystic is someone who has a deep inner awareness of the presence of the divine, of the unity of all life, a deep inner awareness. He didn't say an intellectual awareness. He said a deep inner awareness. Remember, in the New Testament, we're told to go within, to seek the kingdom within, a deep inner awareness of the presence of the divine. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to put it in the context of what do we mean by the Christ? What does the Christ mean? This time of the year, much of our culture is celebrating Christmas. But as I said last week, Christmas is not the only ritual or celebration at this time of the year. In the native religions, the religions of the country dwellers, or as the Romans came to call them, the pagans. And I just need to clarify this. See, what we tend to do in our culture, and our culture, by the way, is not very much different than it was thousands of years ago in terms of the maturity of human consciousness. And Emmett Fox tells us we can read in the Bible, the book of Exodus, of things that happened 4,000 years ago, and we can understand them because we are not too far removed in consciousness from the people portrayed. And in fact, the people that are being portrayed are states of consciousness that are being portrayed. We understand the Pharaoh consciousness. We understand the mentality of being enslaved. We understand that. So in human consciousness, in our human way of doing things, we tend to put a label on something. And we fool ourselves into thinking that once I've put that label on it, I understand it. And we don't understand it. In fact, we may not even understand the label that we've put on it, but we pretend that we do. And we tend to do this particularly with things that are uncomfortable for us, things that we don't like, things that may disagree with our preconceived notions of the way things ought to be and should be. And I'll give you a current day example, and then I'll go back to my point about paganism and pagans. If you say to someone today that God is expressing itself through all of its creation as all of its creation, which we say that all the time, we believe that to be true. When the divine created, it had nothing else to create out of but itself. As Dr. Holmes calls it, the divine stuff, the divine substance of the universe. Substance being that which stands under substance, that which stands under everything is the divine. But if we say that today, somebody is likely to say, well, that's just pantheism or panentheism, two different twists on the same word. That's just pantheism, and they'll dismiss it as if everybody knows that pantheism is something that's wrong and something that shouldn't be discussed. Same way in our political arena, anytime, for example, we talk about healthcare and people say, well, that's socialism. And the implication is that there's something wrong with socialism and therefore we shouldn't talk about it. Instead of getting to the deeper discussion of, well, but what does it mean? How can we get beyond the labels? So my point is that in our society we tend to put labels on things to denigrate them so we don't have to discuss them. We don't have to look at the merits of what's going on. And as Christianity spread from Rome, of course, it encountered many different original religions. The people had religion long before Christianity came along. And people have many different ways of relating to the divine and expressing this relationship to the divine in their daily activity, in their rituals, the things that they do. So one of the ways that the Romans and the Christianity has expanded, one of the ways that it avoided dealing with the native religions and trying to look into them and see what the merit might be was it labeled them as pagan religions. And of course the connotation it comes down to us 2,000 years later is that there's something wrong with that. We don't know what it is. There's something wrong with that, you know. It's kind of like I said, the term socialism or pantheism. Is there's just something about it that has a connotation that it's just not right. And all that pagan meant in the Roman language was the country dwellers, the people who lived out in the country dwellers. So the pagan religions were the religions of the country dwellers. And if you study theology, if you study the history of God, or actually the history of man's interpretation of God, you quickly realize that the people who lived in the country, who lived with animals, who were in an agrarian society, who raised crops and things like that, their gods tended to be feminine. They were feminine gods. Mother Earth, all these kind of things. And the hunter-gatherers, the people who went out and pillaged and plundered and captured and killed and did all those things, their gods tended to be a male god who gave them permission to do this. And I know I'm kind of drifting a little bit off course. But all I want to say is that in the religions of the country dwellers, there's something special about this time of the year. We talked about it last week. The light is coming back. You see, the light is coming back. And I believe they understood it at much more than just a simply physical level that the day was going to get warmer and spring was coming. I think they felt this deep inner awareness that there's something mystical about this time of the year. In Judaism, in the Jewish culture, we celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, the festival of the lights. And the tradition, the tradition around this, the ritual around this, is that there was only enough oil to keep a lamp burning 7 days. But by a miracle, the lamp was able to burn 8 days until somebody could return with more oil. And it burned for the extra day because the very presence of God was with those people. See? So again, we have a deeper connotation, a deeper mystical meaning. The presence of God is with us. See, the presence of God is with us. In that tradition, it is in the form of the candle burning, or the oil lamp, not a candle, excuse me, burning the extra day. And then we come into Christianity, and we come into, and we're going to talk more about the scripture next week and interpreting the scripture of the New Testament through the lens of the metaphysical. But you can't help but recognize that we're told that the name of this child is Emmanuel, which means God is with us. God is with us. So to the country dwellers, maybe God is with us. The days are getting longer. We are connected to the cycle of life. The spring will come and we will plant our crops. To the Jewish culture, God is with us. God is with us. We have the proof. The oil lasted an extra day. And in Christianity, God is with us in this baby Jesus, who would become the Christ, is what we're told in the scripture. He will become the Christ. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what does the Christ mean? What does all this mean? Are we talking about the same thing from different angles? Are we looking at it different ways, And I think we are. I think what we are talking about, I think what the different cultures are talking about, and I know you will, I know that not everyone would agree with this. I understand that. So I'm only stating what I think we're getting to. And that is that in all three examples, we are talking about an awareness, an experience of the mystical, of the presence of the divine as a real, as a tangible, nearer than my hands and feet, closer than my breath experience. So before I go too too far afield. And let me just tell you, to try to talk about the mystical, it is ineffable. It cannot intelligently be talked about. But that doesn't stop us from trying to talk about it. I'm going to recommend that for further study, if you want to explore this topic more, I'm going to give you the references now because I may forget later. In the Science of Mind textbook, I would like you to read 2 chapters. One of them is what the mystics have taught, and then a couple chapters after that. These are in part 4 of the Science of Mind textbook. What the mystics have taught, and then Finding the Christ. Finding the Christ. And the third resource is available online on the internet in its entirety. It was written in 1901, but it's a seminal work on Cosmic Consciousness, Richard Maurice Bucke, B-U-C-K-E, Bucke. It's usually R.M. Bucke if you're looking in a bookstore or on Amazon.com to put it on your Kindle. Now, Bucke was a psychiatrist. He lived in Canada. He was a psychiatrist, and he had the flash. He had this experience of something greater than we are. And he wanted to explore it from a medical perspective. He was a trained medical man. He was a psychiatrist. He said, did something weird just happen to me? Does this happen to other people? Has this happened to others in the past? What is this? So he went about exploring what he termed cosmic consciousness. And his little book by the same title, he documents at least 36 different cases, and I think more, of people who have in their lives here on earth exhibited the symptoms, if you want to call them that, from a psychiatrist's point of view, but the characteristics might be another way of putting it, of this contact with the divine, this experience of the divine. So we need to talk a little bit about the mystical. What is the mystical? And then we need to carry that over into our definition of, well, what is the Christ? And how do we find the Christ? And where do we find the Christ? And what is Christmas all about? Because Christmas is about celebrating the Christ. And if we don't know what we mean by the Christ, then it all seems kind of strange to us. Maybe it's just a commercial holiday that we go to department stores, or maybe it's something that a particular denomination does in their own unique way, or maybe it is something for all of humanity when we understand what it is. So this sense of the mystical, as Dr. Holmes tells us, it is someone who has a deep inner awareness, a deep sense of awareness of the presence of the divine and of the unity of life, right? The connectedness of life, the allness of life. The way Richard Maurice Bucke puts it in the introduction to his book is he describes 3 levels of consciousness, which is interesting, because I usually talk about the 3 levels of maturity of consciousness. And while our 2 models don't necessarily go exactly together, I think they probably fit pretty well. And he says the first level of consciousness is what he calls simple consciousness. And he said human beings share this simple level of consciousness with the animals. We're similar. He says you have a pet dog, and you understand what the dog is thinking, and you understand what the dog smells, and the best you can. I mean, their olfactory senses are better than ours. Their hearing is better than ours. But they're smelling something. They're hearing something. You can imagine them enjoying their food and tasting their food, and it's not hard for us to understand them because we share that same level of simple consciousness. We are aware of our surroundings. We are aware of our bodies. We are aware of the food we drink, things like that, simple awareness. And the next level of consciousness he calls self-conscious. I think I would call it self-awareness rather than self-conscious. And the only reason is that in our society, to be self-conscious kind of indicates a degree of timidness or shame or something like that. That suddenly we're aware that everybody's paying attention to us, and we change our behavior because we're aware of that. We inhibit ourselves, we restrict ourselves. Where self-awareness is as we are who we are, we do what we do, but we are aware of it. When I used to teach leadership in corporate America, we would tell people that they need to be self-aware without being self-conscious. Just be aware of what's going on, be aware of what you're doing, be aware of what you're saying, but don't be inhibited because of your own awareness. Don't be censored or restricted. So the second level of consciousness to buck is one where we actually can do something that, as far as we know, we can do something that even the animals that we share simple intelligence with, the apes probably being the closest animal relative, but certainly higher mammals, things like that, is to become aware of thinking, to become aware of the thought process. See, we can actually, when we move out of that level of simple consciousness, which goes kind of neatly with that level 1 that I keep talking about, where the power is out there and we're trying to please people and power and all those things. When we move into level 2, we start to become aware of what we're thinking. We can become the witness. We can become the observer. A detached observer. So when we learn how to meditate, and this is why I believe meditation is an important spiritual practice, when we learn how to meditate, we learn how to separate ourselves from the thoughts that go through our mind. In simple consciousness, we have a thought and we think we are the thought and we think we had that thought. I am hungry, I am angry, those kind of things. We get an impulse, and that impulse has to be satisfied. We have to go out and do something about it. We get thirsty, we have to go get a drink. We get hungry, we have to go get something to eat. And there's very little awareness or filtering or editing or just simply detachment from that. So if we get angry, we think we have to act out in our anger. If we are embarrassed, we think we need to behave accordingly because we're embarrassed. All of those things. There's no separation in that level of consciousness between the thought that arises and the individual who becomes aware of the thought. They believe that they are that thought. Very important, because we go through life and we are given these identities from our parents, and then we modify them and we accept them for ourselves, and then we act as if we are that perception that we have created. You go to a business conference and people say, well, I am a doctor, or I am a manager, or I am an accountant, or I am this. And no, you're not. No, they are not. That's their job, that's what they do, but that's not who they are. So in the second level, we start to get into this self-awareness. We can observe a thought or an emotion without feeling that we have to act out upon it. So one of the simplest techniques in meditation we teach people is to just sit quietly, breathe in, breathe out. Count from 1 to 5 over and over. And when something comes up, instead of becoming entangled with it, engaged with it, and following the thought, we just say, oh, look, there goes the thought. Oh, look, there goes the thought. If an emotion comes up, you can say the same thing. Oh, look, there goes an emotion. So we have the ability as human beings, as spiritual beings, we have the ability to become self-aware. We have this ability, and as you've heard me say, it doesn't mean we use it. It doesn't mean we spend a lot of time with it. But truly, of all of the creatures on earth, so far, and we may find out differently as we go along, but so far, we human beings are the only species that we know of that has the ability to be self-reflective, to become self-aware of thought. In other words, we can make thought an object. And I often say, if that's the one thing that makes us unique of all of the creatures on earth, perhaps that is the thing we should be spending most of our time on, instead of spending most of our time doing the things that the other creatures do quite naturally. And in Jewish mysticism, in the Kabbalah, they talk about this. They talk about the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and the speaker. So, which think about this. A lot of traditions talk about the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and the human. But in the Kabbalah tradition, the human and the animal are not separated, but the speaker is. The speaker is. And what is the speaker? The speaker is the self-aware person. And the speaker is one who is no longer compelled by the same things that compel everything else on earth. It doesn't mean that we don't eat or drink or sleep or do those things. It means that they don't occupy our consciousness. We don't predominantly dwell on those. I mean, go to the water cooler at work, turn on the TV, and you'll find that most of what is going on in the drama of life has to do with things that the animals do without even discussing. Right? You know, they eat, they sleep, they reproduce, they do those things that you would say are associated with the first three chakras, and they do them without discussion. That's it. It's just part of life, and they do it. We human beings who have the capability of being self-aware, we spend all our time talking about those first three chakras. Willpower, who's in charge, who's going to win, who's dominant here, all those kind of things, you know. Survival, who's the enemy, who do we have to fight, who do we have to be afraid of today, all of that. Sex just dominates, you know, entertainment and the news. So as human beings, we spend all our time preoccupied with things that animals do naturally, and yet we are the only ones that have the ability that we know of to be self-aware. So Buck talks about this second level of consciousness, then, this self-awareness. And he says, but there's a third level of consciousness. There's one that goes even beyond that, and that's what he calls the cosmic consciousness. The cosmic consciousness. And he says the cosmic consciousness is as far removed from self-awareness, or as he calls it, self-consciousness, as self-consciousness is removed from simple consciousness. And what happens in this level, which I will call the mystical level, I will call the Christ, what happens in this level of consciousness is what Dr. Holmes says is this deep inner awareness of our unity with all life. If we feel the presence, we are connected to all of life. And along with this just kind of general feeling of, I guess the best way to describe it is a lack of otherness. We are still unique, we are still individuals, we still have an identity and consciousness, but the separation from other people and other things are gone. It's the Zen of it, you know. It is, in Christianity, it is the I and the Father are one of it. It is that third level of mystical consciousness. There is an intuitive knowing. In other words, we have knowledge that we have no process by which that knowledge came to us. I don't know if that makes sense. Suppose I wanted to call somebody on my telephone, and I didn't know their number. I could go to the phone directories, which are all on the internet now. I could go to White Pages, and I could search for their phone number. That would be one way of doing it. An intuitive knowing would be if that number just simply presented itself to my consciousness. That would be an intuitive knowing. And in this level of cosmic consciousness, in this level of mystical consciousness, in this level of Christ consciousness, there is a knowing that is beyond explanation. It is beyond a rational understanding. It just is. Now, if you need a handle to put on that, a way of kind of coming to say, how could that possibly be? It's as we said in the opening treatment, the omniscience, the all-knowing of God is omnipresence. It is everywhere present. And since it is everywhere present, it is right where I think I am. And I say I think I am because if I am part of that cosmic consciousness, then this experience that I'm having of being limited in time and place here is only a temporary experience, and it is not the total picture. At the level of the soul, I am connected with everyone and everything. So whatever needs to be known is right here. And it can reveal itself to me without the normal human process. And in this mystical state, then, we have this experience of knowing. That is one of the characteristics of it. Now, Buck goes on to tell us, and he says there's really only two ways to know about this experience. One is to have it, and until you have it, the other is to study about people who have had it. And that's why he wrote the book, and that's why I recommend the book, because many of us have not had the experience. And when it first comes to us, it is strange, it is odd. We may think that we're losing sanity, we're losing our mind. What is going on here? And it is a glimpse. It is, as Buck says, it's like the door has cracked open just a little bit, and we are able to see through it. Plato described it as we are living our lives in a cave, and we are bound in a position where we can only see the shadows on the wall. And we think the shadows are the reality. And one day somebody in the cave breaks loose of the chains that held them, and they go outside, and they're blinded by the light, first thing, right? Blinded by the light. And then they recognize that there's a whole other reality, a whole other way of knowing, of being and experiencing. And they come back into the cave and they try to tell the other people, you don't understand. What you thought was real is only a glimpse, a shadow, a reflection of that which is real. There's a whole other world outside. And the people tell this one, you better sit down. There's something wrong with you. You're not well. We need to put you in the hospital. Just a side note, when Marconi told his friends that he had figured out a way to send Morse code through the airwaves without wires, they had him committed for 28 days of observation. They thought he was crazy. So when we first have this experience, when we first start to have the experience, this otherness, this other reality, this mystical experience, it may confuse us, or it may frighten us, and we have to recognize that it is actually the glimpse. It is actually the glimpse of that which is. In some of the Native American religions, in some of the Native American cultures, they recognize that this world that we call the waking world was the dream, and the other world is the reality. So the first thing that we have to understand as we come into this time of Christmas, this time of celebrating the life. Remember, it said that we're celebrating the light. In the native religions, in the religions of the country dwellers, people celebrating the solstice, the return of the light. In Judaism, celebrating the light, right? the oil has lasted the 8th day. In Christianity, we're told that Jesus is the light of the world. And really what we're doing is if we can become observers or witnesses, if we can separate ourselves from the ritual and from the custom, and we can stop and ask ourselves, what does this mean to us? See, then we can say that what we're celebrating is the light within. We're celebrating the enlightenment. We're celebrating the illumination. We're celebrating the ability of each and every person, regardless of where or whether they go to church, the ability of each and every person to make contact with the divine, with the presence of God within, which is what Ernest Holmes called the Christ. He said the Christ is not a person but a principle. It is the principle of universal sonship. Now he called it sonship, but we could probably call it, universal childhood. We are all little sparks of that divine. Osho would put it in the example of the wave in the ocean, which I also think is a good one. The ocean is not separate. The wave is not separate from the ocean. The wave is a very part of the ocean. The wave is a very expression of the ocean. You could not reach out and pick the wave up off the ocean and move it someplace else and have it be a wave. It'd be a puddle maybe, but it wouldn't be a wave. So if the ocean could think, the ocean would not perceive the wave as being anything other than itself. But if the wave could think as we think, the wave could believe itself to be separate from the ocean, when in fact it is not. So we have this perception of ourselves as being separated from God, as being essentially different than God. And what we have to come back to is this idea of that God created in its own image and likeness. And it doesn't mean that it looks like us. What it means is that we share its nature, the divine nature, the consciousness, right? We use these bodies for time, and then we leave these bodies, but consciousness continues, and consciousness was somewhere before it got here, and it is somewhere after it goes here. So we are in the image and likeness of the divine consciousness. We have the ability to be self-aware, but we need to exercise that ability. And we have the ability to experience our unity and our oneness. Can you imagine if one day the wave was able to say, hey, I am one with the entire ocean. I am one with each and every other wave. It doesn't matter whether it's on the Atlantic shore, the Pacific shore, or over in Cape Town, or somewhere in India. It doesn't matter if it's down in Antarctica or up in Greenland. I am one with each and every other wave. I am one with each and every other part of the ocean. And I feel my unity. I feel my oneness. I feel my connection with all of that while still keeping my identity in consciousness. I no longer think of myself as separated from, apart from, or different than. I suddenly realize that, oh my goodness, what is true of the ocean is true of me. I am not all of the ocean. I will never be all of the ocean. But whatever I am is some part of the ocean. And whatever I am is some part of God. I may not have always known that. I may not have always acted that way. But I didn't create this life. I didn't create this body. Something else did, and I am part of that. So this idea of the mystical, which we need to understand before we can fully understand the Christ, this idea of the mystical then is this idea of cosmic consciousness, this idea of the realization and the experience through realization. Right? Remember I tell you, Joel Goldsmith says, if God is everywhere present and God is love, why don't we see love everywhere? Why do we see hate? And we don't see love everywhere and we see hate because the love of God is not realized. It must be realized. We must become awakened to it. We must become illuminated. Right? We must become one with. And that's what the mystical is. And that's what the Christ means, as we're talking about today. So the very word, the Christ, the very term, the Christ, if you'll notice, excuse me, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, by the way, most of what we get in Christianity comes to us through Paul, the writings of Paul. When the Romans went into Jerusalem in 66 AD and they sacked Jerusalem and they sacked the temple, not only did they destroy Judaism as it was known up until that point in time, which was, centered on the temple, but they destroyed Christianity as well, because the early followers of Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus, they were in Jerusalem, so they kind of got scattered to the winds. And Paul went and took his idea of Christianity, and I'll explain that in just a minute. He took that to the world. He's a very busy man. It's amazing if you look at what he did in a short period of time. He must have been a workaholic, I swear. But most of the ideas that we get handed down to us in New Testament theology came to us from the writings of Paul. And you have to remember that Paul never met the man Jesus. But Paul had a mystical experience. Paul was knocked off his horse and he was blinded by the light on the road to Damascus, which the whole story about the road to Damascus is a teaching story. I just don't want you to take that quite literally. I'll just leave you with the idea that Damascus was in a totally different province than Jerusalem was. Two different governors, two different Roman governors. Paul had no authority to go anywhere and arrest anyone. So something else that needs to be considered in the light of history there. But in the light of the context of a teaching story, he had this deep inner awareness that he called the Christ. And his writings and his teachings then came out from that. Now they got modified over the years as the level 1 folks kind of went in and edited things down. But if you're interested in exploring that possibility, I recommend 2 books to you. One is called The Gnostic, Gnostic, The Gnostic Paul, and that's by Elaine Pagels. And the other one is The Mythmaker. I think the subtitle is Paul and it's The Genius of Paul, The Genius of Paul and The Mythmaker. There's 2 books by two different authors. One of the authors is Samuel Sandmel, and the other one is Hiram Maccabee. And they talk about Paul's ministry in light of the culture and in the context of the culture and the Jewish tradition of the time. And Elaine Pagels talks about this idea of the Gnosticism, which is the inner knowing, right? The inner knowing. How you can see it evident in Paul's writings, but it was tended to be covered up later on by the people who were taking charge. The level 1 people like to take charge. So if we go back and look at the term the Christ, that is the Greek word Christos, and it was kind of the best translation that could come to us from the Greek for a Hebrew word or an Aramaic word, which meant Messiah, Mashiach, something like that. I can't pronounce it properly. But a Messiah was one in whom the presence of God was visible, was evident. That's what a Messiah was. When kings were put on the throne, their heads were anointed with oil to indicate that in this one the presence of God is visible. We do this today when we baptize children, even in religious science, in our naming ceremonies. We take a little oil and we put it on the child's head. And so there's something about this person that we recognize the presence of God within them. That was what was considered to be a Messiah, a strong leader, one who would get us out of trouble. Excuse me for coughing. Now I want to give you my synopsis of Old Testament theology in a nutshell, and I'm sure there are other ways of looking at it, and I'm quite open to it. But if you look at the theme, there's a theme that runs through over and over and over again. It's like the same story told in different settings. It's like once upon a time fairy tale told this way and that way and the other way to our children. But these are teaching stories that describe levels of consciousness, states of consciousness that are there for purpose. But in general, and I realize this is way oversimplification, but in general, if you look at the stories in the Old Testament, you start out with the people know what they're supposed to do. God tells them what they're supposed to do. They have a covenant with God. God gives them the commandments. They know exactly what it is that they're supposed to do in order to please their God. And I would say, at a deeper level, in order to experience their God. But people being people, they don't do what they're supposed to do, right? As Paul says, the good that we're supposed to do, we don't do it, but the evil we're not supposed to do, we just sign right up for that, And this is why the story in the Garden of Eden is a humorous story. God says, whatever you do, don't eat from that tree, whatever you do. And of course, human nature, well, what are human beings going to do? All right, let's jump right in here. I laugh. The way that coffee was discovered allegedly is that people who took care of goats noticed their goats going over and eating the beans off of this particular bush, and the goats started to act strangely. So what did they do? Did they keep the goats away from the bush? No, they went and tried some of the beans for themselves. It's like out in California, somebody figured out that if you lick a certain frog, you'll have a hallucinogenic experience. And I think, who figured that out? Somebody saw a dog go over, lick the frog, and the dog started to act nuts, and they said, oh, wait, bring that frog over here to me. So I digress, but as human beings, we don't do the things that we're supposed to do. We like to go explore the things that we're not supposed to do. So in the Old Testament, what you found was people knew what they were supposed to do. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. They got themselves in some sort of trouble. A prophet came along, and the prophet was just a person who said, listen, the reason that you're in trouble is you're not doing the things that you're supposed to do. And then on some occasions they brought doom and gloom to themselves because they wouldn't change. And on other occasions a strong leader, a Messiah, arose up amongst them who led them back to the proper way, the proper relationship with God, and then things got better. So so what you'll find is then that that's really the story of each and every one of us, is that we all understand what we're supposed to do in our spiritual practice, in our prayer, in our meditation, in our study, but we get very distracted in life. We get very distracted in life, and we don't necessarily do it. But when we do it, when we do the things that we're supposed to do, when we do bring ourselves back into the discipline, if you will, meaning doing that which needs to be done, well, then we can experience the growth in our soul. So this idea of the Christ then, if you think about the setting, and we're going to talk about this in detail next week, but if you think about the setting, it was a dark time for the people. They were having a lot of trouble with the Roman government. They were looking for that strong leader to arise, to lead them out of their trouble. They were looking for the Messiah as kind of the religious historical context that we're given. And that Messiah arrived in the person of Jesus. But the child Jesus became the Christ. And then later we take it into a different context, and instead of saying Jesus was not a political leader, but a spiritual leader, we say, oh, wait a second. Each and every one of us, all of us, has difficulties in life, right? Where the first tenet of Buddhism is, the first noble truth is life is suffering. Each of us has difficulties in life. And the way out of those difficulties is not in our human nature. It is in discovering our spiritual nature. It is in doing the things that we ought to do, our spiritual practice, in order to create within us an opening where the divine presence can make itself known. Just very briefly, I just want to say that the most important ingredient in all of this is our desire. In the East, we're told, don't go seeking God unless you're seeking God as you would seek a pond if your hair was on fire. And in our culture, particularly with the technology that we have today, we have the ability to keep ourselves distracted from the minute we wake up in the morning until the minute we go to sleep at night. We've got radio, we've got TV, we've got the internet, we've got cell phones. There's literally, we can be connected to the entire world at every moment in time with constant chiming in and buzzing in and phones ringing and everything else to distract us. And if we succumb to those distractions, which I think in many cases, we're happy to do so, because we're not really certain that we want to go explore the spiritual. We don't figure we're quite ready for it yet. But we must desire. We must desire. We must desire the experience of the presence of the divine. We have to come to a realization that all of these distractions in life are leaving us, and we are leaving them. That the only thing that we will take with us when we leave is consciousness, so we might as well develop our consciousness and our awareness of consciousness as much as we can while we're here. We must really become self-conscious and self-aware, as Buck puts it in level 2. We must truly desire the experience of the presence of God above all else, more than anything. And that doesn't mean that we have to give up anything. It means that we will experience everything in a different way. We'll experience everything at a different level. So as we prepare to go into next week, and next week we're going to just kind of pick right up, and we're going to look at what the New Testament narratives about the birth of Jesus tell us. And I need to quickly jump back to Paul, because I forgot in all of my discussions of Paul, what I was trying to get to is Paul always used the term Christ Jesus, not Jesus Christ, Christ Jesus. So our society says Jesus Christ as if it was the first and last name of someone like John Smith. But Paul always used the term Christ Jesus, because the Christ, right? Jesus being one in whom the awareness of the presence of God was so fully realized that he became the Christ. The Christ was the important thing, not the physical Jesus. So what we want to do is we want to awaken within ourselves the desire to experience the Christ, the presence of God within. And the only place that we're going to find that is within. And the only one who can do that is us. No one can do it for you. There's not a fairy godmother who's going to come along with a magic wand, tap you on the shoulder, and poof, you are going to be awakened. It's an inside job that we have to do. We have to dedicate ourselves to do it. We have to want to do it. Then we have to do the things that we know to do. Thousands of years ago, we were told, be still and know. That's it. Be still and know. We've been playing around with that idea for thousands of years, saying, but what does that mean? But how do you do that? Be still and know. You go to a Zen monastery and you say, I want enlightenment, and they say, sit down and meditate. That's all. Sit down and meditate. So we have the tools in our spiritual toolbox. We know what to do. We have to awaken the desire to use them. We have to awaken the desire to become self-aware and self-conscious. We have to awaken the desire to move beyond self-awareness into cosmic awareness, mystical awareness, into the experience of the Christ. And then we have to do the things that we ought to do. We have to just do them, and nobody else can do them for us. No one can go to the gym and work out for us and have us feel better. No one can do our spiritual practice for us. So as we move into this Christmas season, as we move into this celebration of the Christ, let's consider that what we are celebrating is our ability, our divine destiny, if you will, to awaken to the presence of God within us. And what we are celebrating is our commitment to do it now, rather than later. Right now. Beginning today. Whatever level of practice we've been doing up until today, we'll do more. It's just that simple. We just do the things that we need to do. We awaken the desire in our heart to experience the presence of God. So I invite you, if you will, go online and look for Richard Maurice Bucke, B-U-C-K-E, Cosmic Consciousness. Read the chapters in the Science of Mind textbook on what the mystics have taught and finding the Christ. If you don't have a textbook, the 1926 version of the Science of Mind textbook is available in its entirety in PDF format on the web. You just have to search for it a little bit. Read what Ernest Holmes had to say about the mystics, about finding the Christ. If you're interested in the history of religion and theology, get Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Young, the Gnostic Paul. She also wrote someone wrote the Gnostic Young, but she wrote the Gnostic Paul. The Gnostic Paul, and see how Paul's mystical ideas kind of filter their way through Christianity, even though they've been cloaked in more traditional ideas. The more traditional ideas were designed, of course, to say you have to come to the authority. You have to come to us in authority, and we will do what needs to be done for your salvation for you. Whereas the mystical idea was we have to come to the presence of God ourselves. We have to allow it to reveal itself through us. And then for the history of how New Testament Christianity spread, I recommend The Genius of Paul and The Genius of Paul, and then The Mythmaker. And The Mythmaker is by Hiram Maccabee, and The Genius of Paul is by Samuel Sandmel, S-A-N-D-M-E-L-L. Both are Jewish scholars who talk about the growth of New Testament Christianity in the context of what the Jewish culture and the Jewish history says about it. So it's all interesting stuff. But the most important thing is, do you truly desire to awaken? Or is this the year that you truly desire to awaken? And I think it is. So thank you for being with us.